A group of celebrities and politicians here in Germany has launched an appeal to have WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange released from prison in Britain. More than 130 public figures are urging the UK to follow the advice of the UN Special Rapporteur on torture to release Assange on medical grounds. Now, Germany's former foreign minister, Sigmar Gabriel, you see him right there, he is among those who signed this letter. We'll hear from the UN Special Rapporteur in just a moment, but first, let's take a closer look at Julian Assange, the founder of WikiLeaks, which publishes news leaks and classified material. He is in a high-security British prison awaiting extradition to the U.S. on charges of espionage. He previously evaded capture by taking refuge in the Embassy of Ecuador.
The first few months that Julian Assange spent in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, it was all defiant and optimistic gestures. 7 years later, he would emerge as a broken man. When British police dragged the WikiLeaks founder out of the diplomatic mission in 2019, he looked confused and was almost unrecognizable. A UN expert on torture said Assange showed symptoms of psychological torture. Some fear this torture may still be happening today. So how did we get here, and why? Julian Assange took refuge in the Ecuadorian embassy in 2012, after Sweden asked the UK to extradite the WikiLeaks founder to answer allegations of rape in that country. Assange has always denied those allegations, saying they were a pretense to have him eventually extradited to the United States, where he is wanted on espionage charges.
As WikiLeaks stands under threat, so does the freedom of expression and the health of all our societies.
His supporters share this view. They say the Swedish rape allegations were fabricated and an excuse to punish Assange for the leaking of hundreds of thousands of confidential government documents and for exposing possible war crimes. One high-profile leak was a video obtained from the US military, which WikiLeaks says shows US soldiers opening fire on people in Baghdad and killing several civilians and 2 journalists. Assange is now in a maximum security prison in the UK and continues to fight against his extradition to the United States. If he loses his fight and is convicted in the US, the WikiLeaks founder faces up to 175 years in jail. The rape case in Sweden has since been dropped.
And for more on this, I'm joined now by Niels Meltzer. He is the United Nations Special Rapporteur on torture. He investigated the case of Julian Assange. It's good to have you on the show. You know, I have to ask you, our viewers watching and who maybe have followed the story of Julian Assange may be asking, why is the UN Special Rapporteur on torture involved here? Has Julian Assange, has he been tortured?
Yes, absolutely. And I can assure you, it wasn't an easy step for me to get involved in this case. I was myself a bit poisoned by this public narrative about him. But when I went to visit him and with 2 medical doctors, we examined him according to a specialized medical protocol focusing on torture victims. And he showed all the symptoms that are typical for a person who has been psychologically tortured.
And is the claim that he is being psychologically tortured in a British prison? Is that what I'm understanding?
Well, at the time, obviously, that was 4 weeks after his arrest by the British authorities. It was more about the consequences of his prolonged confinement at the Ecuadorian embassy. Now, unfortunately, his state of health has deteriorated and his treatment has not improved in British detention. His due process rights have been seriously and systematically violated, causing intense anxiety, and on top of the health effects he has already suffered before, certainly amount to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment.
Well, Mr. Meltzer, I think people watching may be asking, considering that Julian Assange chose to go to the Ecuadorian embassy there where he sought asylum, he was there voluntarily. He wasn't forced to go to the embassy. So can we talk about him being tortured even though he wasn't being forced to be there?
Oh, it's a fair question, but you see, if you look from the perspective of any asylum seeker is, a refugee actually is voluntarily in his host state, but it's not because it would be acceptable for him to go back. And that precisely is the problem with Julian Assange. Yes, he was voluntarily at the embassy, but he was unable to leave the embassy without risking serious violations of his human rights. I also have to be precise. I mean, torture does not necessarily mean we're inflicting pain and suffering in order to get information, to interrogate someone. The main purpose in the world of torture, of ill-treating people, is to intimidate others, supporters, or in this case, other journalists who might be, tempted to publish secret information.
Okay, and this initiative that we had earlier in the show, how helpful do you think that the signatures of 130 German politicians and celebrities, how helpful can they be in the case of Julian Assange?
Oh, I think it's incredibly helpful to see, politicians, former politicians, high-profile personalities recognizing the risk that this case poses for the democracy and for the rule of law in our societies, and so they can draw attention of the public to that, the attention that so far, and unfortunately, the mainstream media has failed to draw to this case.
Nils Melzer, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on torture. Mr. Melzer, we appreciate your time tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.